Hello. All right. So first, I'd like to introduce Eric Odell on the corner there. He is the Species Conservation Program Manager, Carnivores, with the Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And next we have Rebecca Waters. She's a Wolverine researcher with the Northern Rockies Colorado Conservation Cooperation. And unfortunately, Bridget, I don't think she could make it tonight. But we also have Paige Singer, a conservation biologist, and also GIS specialist with Rocky Mountain Wild. And also we have Caitlin Balch-Burnett. She's a Colorado Outreach representative of Defenders of Wildlife. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric and the rest of these great panelists to describe what they're working on, and then we'll field some questions afterward. Thank you.
Is this on? This is not on. We'll have to use subtitles for me as well. How's that? Is that good? Thanks, Cole. My name is Eric. I'm with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which is the state wildlife agency. So we're responsible for managing all the wildlife species, game and non-game species in the state. And my interest and my expertise is particularly on the non-game carnivore species. And so I want to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of thinking about wolverines and so on. And in order to do that, I have to take a little bit of a history lesson, a little bit of a step back and talk about lynx too, because it is all geared from a product and something that we had in the mid-'90s. So in the mid-1990s, we as the State Wildlife Agency came up with a plan, a conservation plan, to talk about the reestablishment of both lynx and wolverine to the state. Both of these are native carnivore species that have been here historically, and then for a variety of reasons were extirpated out of the state, no longer here. And so in the mid-'90s, we began with this process, thinking about how would we do this? Is this something that we want to do? And at the time, decided that we do, and lynx was the species of choice for a variety of reasons. And I'm not going to get too much into that right now, but we did that. In late 1999, 2000s, we began a decade-long process of reintroducing and reestablishing a lynx population into primarily southwestern Colorado, but they've expanded beyond that area too. In 2010, 2011, we called that program a success, and because we had documented first, second, and third generation, meaning reproduction, meaning that animals that were brought to Colorado from Canada and Alaska had successfully reproduced. Those young had reproduced, and those young had reproduced. So we felt that we had a self-sustaining native population of lynx in the state. So with that success, it kind of shifted gears a little bit. Let's go back to that plan that we talked about in the early 90s or the mid-90s and think about the other species. Let's start to think about wolverine. And we learned a whole lot about the process, both scientifically and logistically. How do you physically get animals from the northern part of their range and transport them down into the southern range and release them and have a successful establishment of a species. And so we learned a lot from the science and the logistics side of things. We also learned a lot about the politics of things. When we began the lynx reintroduction program, lynx were not a federally listed species. They still under state management authority. And just as a very brief thing, and Bridget can get more into it in a moment, but when a species becomes listed, management authority technically becomes that of Fish and Wildlife Service, and state loses direct management authority. Point of that is that when there is a listed species on the landscape, that changes some perceived and real logistical concerns that land users have. And so we ran into that with lynx, and we learned a lot from that. The land use management had become a different animal, so to speak, when they became a listed federally protected species. And so when we began this process, our director at the time said that we're not going to do a wolverine reintroduction based on what we learned from the lynx reintroduction unless we can address the social, political, and economic concerns that stakeholders present and that they reflect to us. And so we began a stakeholder process where we engaged with ski industry, ranching, agricultural industry, recreation industry, conservation community, timber and mining, off-highway vehicles, and I'm probably leaving out a few groups, and listen to what their concerns were, and what are their concerns, and if there are, why are they? And part of that reason is because in order for us as a state wildlife agency, this is unique to Colorado, in order for us to pursue a reintroduction program, we have to have state legislative approval to do that. And so in order to cover that political base, we have to cover the social base and have to understand what the publics that we have to interact with say. By and large, and to paraphrase probably a year-long process, the concern wasn't so much about having wolverines themselves on the landscape. Nobody really felt that having wolverines were going to be an impediment or a threat to any of their particular interests, but it came back to the land use restrictions, or the perceived potential for land use restrictions from having wolverines on the landscape. And so there's a whole other cycle of things that's happening at this time, with wolverines being petitioned for listing, some agreements that are being made, and ultimately a proposal to list the wolverine. And I don't want to get too far into that because I think that's what Bridget will spend some time talking about. List the wolverine as an endangered species or as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. And so there's some opportunities to address some of these concerns from the stakeholders, depending on how that ultimate proposal comes out. And again, this is the nexus between the State Wildlife Agency and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'll leave some of that for Bridget to talk about too. And so we're in this, in terms of where we are now, we've had these stakeholder conversations, we understand what their concerns are, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is in this position now where they've made a proposed rule. That proposed rule is due to be finalized later this fall, and based on what comes of that, will kind of depict what kind of a political landscape we have to think about. Certainly wolverines are native to the state, and just to talk a little bit about it, they did talk about the animal that came down here. Part of the reason for thinking about wolverine reintroduction to Colorado is that they are native to the state, one thing, and also this threat, this concern of climate change, and the concern about, if this denning habitat, the springtime snowpack, this denning habitat is a critical factor for wolverine. How does Colorado play into that? And the way that the thought goes is that much of so Colorado is certainly the lowest in latitude, but it's also the highest in elevation. So many of these areas that are predicted to lose a lot of that springtime snowpack further north in Idaho, Montana especially, are very low elevation, higher latitude. Colorado's elevation may benefit the latency of the springtime snowpack, and so the models anyways are suggesting that may be a case, and that may be a reason to consider for the long-term conservation of the species. And so that's where we are. We've gone through some of the social aspects, some of the political aspects, and waiting to see where we end up this fall with Fish and Wildlife Service's proposal, and we'll move forward from there. So I think at this point I'll just leave it with that history, go down the rest of the panel. We can open it up for questions later.
All right, sorry I missed the introductions. I got so sucked into that great movie, and I realized it was ending and I had to use the restroom. So that's where I was. But I'm Bridget Fahey. I'm the Regional Endangered Species Chief for Fish and Wildlife Service Region 6, which covers an 8-state area, including some of the Wolverine states, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado. So just to give a little bit of history, the Fish and Wildlife Service's history with Wolverine goes back, I guess, over a decade. We were petitioned to list the species in the early 90s for the first time. And we actually at that time didn't have a lot of information about Wolverine. We knew that they were fairly rare, but we didn't have a lot of science to speak on whether they were threatened. And just from a Endangered Species Act perspective, rarity does not necessarily translate to endangerment. Some species are naturally rare, and when we're looking at the question of whether they're threatened or endangered, we're looking into the future and seeing if their future is threatened in some way. So we knew they were rare. We weren't sure they were threatened. The first couple times we were petitioned, or at least the first time we were petitioned to list the species, we declined to list it because we just didn't have science indicating they were in trouble. In fact, Wolverine are a species that are making a comeback here in the lower 48, and I'm not sure that came through with the movie at all, but we suspect that Wolverine were probably completely extirpated from the United States south of the Canada border in the early 1900s due to large-scale predator control campaigns, poisoning, shooting, trapping. We lost our wolverines. Most of the states then, at that time, chose to put some protections in place. So it protected wolverine from being hunted and being trapped. We stopped some of the large-scale predator poisoning campaigns. And so wolverine have been kind of slowly and tenaciously coming back in the lower 48, mostly coming down in a wave from Canada and recolonizing further and further and further south. And so we've had an increasing population over the last couple decades. So that's good news for the wolverine. And then we got repetitioned sort of in the later, in the 2000s to look at the status again. The climate science at that time wasn't really ripe, and so we did not list it again. And this is a good kind of example of the way the Endangered Species Act works, is over time, as you get better science, you can adjust your approach to incorporate that science. And so we finally did get more science on wolverine and its likely relationship with snow and what was happening to that snow. And so we, as a response to a petition, we did propose to list the wolverine as a threatened species in February of last year. So right now the wolverine does not have protection under the Act. The Act has a lot of public involvement and opportunities for involvement with the scientific community. At the time we proposed to list the wolverine, this is kind of a new threat for us here in the Mountain Prairie region. We've never listed a species based on the threat of climate change alone. As you're probably aware, polar bear was the first sort of species of national significance that was listed due to climate change. And so when we were kind of looking at that as a threat and not necessarily seeing a species response to that yet right now, we wanted to do our rulemaking in kind of a thoughtful way that addressed the uniqueness of the threat of climate change. At the same time, we didn't want to tell a story of sort of gloom and doom, that we're going to list the wolverine and watch it go down the tubes due to a threat that we can't do much about. And so at the same time we proposed to list the wolverine as threatened, we proposed two other very important pieces of rulemaking. We proposed an experimental non-essential area called a 10J area here in Colorado to facilitate a reintroduction into the state. So our recovery strategy would be, in the face of climate change, if the species is listed, we want the wolverine to be resilient to the impacts of climate change and the impacts of decreasing snowpack. And one way we could tackle that is to put wolverine in parts of their former range that they have not yet naturally recolonized, in the hopes that some of those areas will be able to retain snowpack into the future, because some of the areas where we do have wolverine, say Idaho and parts of Montana, are probably going to lose the snowpack that wolverine need. And so that was part of our strategy. So we did have a proposed 10J rule. We also had a special rule that limited the regulations, the take prohibitions that the wolverine would receive. So we actually analyzed lots of other threats in the listing, recreation and mining and grazing. And wolverine, unlike the lynx, is not really a management-heavy species. The areas that they survive on, there's not a lot of human activities going on in the first place. Those activities occur at relatively low levels. The wolverine doesn't appear to be that sensitive to those kind of disturbances. And so we proposed a set of protective regulations that's pretty relaxed compared to what you give most threatened species. And so all of those proposed rulemakings are still kind of out there in the public arena for public review and comment at this time. And so, this is a really good time for you guys to kind of get interested and engaged on wolverine, because we are currently in an open comment period. I should add that typically we would have finalized the rulemaking in February of this year. Whenever we propose to list a species, we ask for public comments and peer review. And we got some substantial scientific concerns raised by our peer reviewers, some of whom were in the movie, so now I know what they look like. And also from a bunch of our state partners. Some of the states had some concerns because of this weird situation where we're in, where you have an increasing population and it's counterintuitive that you'd list a species that's on the rise. And so we're kind of looking pretty far into the future, out into 2085, which is when we kind of start having our concern about the future of the wolverine. And so we invoked a 6-month extension to our rulemaking process to try to resolve some of the complex scientific issues raised by our peer reviewers and by the states. We convened a peer review panel to help us wade through that information. And we actually just held that a couple weeks ago. The report from this panel is in the works of being put together. That's going to be also out for public comments before the public comment period closes on May 6th. So we've got a public comment period closing, open through May 6th, and then we are having a deadline of our final decision in August 2014. So that includes that 6-month extension. So we're kind of in this ripe area for involvement right now. So that's really all I had to say. Did I cover everything?
Okay, can you guys hear me? Is that picking me up? Okay. This is the most inconvenient fashion array for putting this microphone on. My name is Rebecca Waters, and I direct the Mongolian Wolverine Research Project. I am a research associate up with the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative, which is based out of Jackson, Wyoming, and I also work cooperatively with the Bioregions International Program, which is based in Bozeman. And I got involved with Wolverine research back in 2006 as a volunteer. I was doing my master's degree on wolves, and I'm actually kind of a conflict-averse person. And I came from Boston, Massachusetts as like a liberal vegetarian and showed up in these ranching communities in Wyoming and said, so, what do you think about wolves? And I quickly learned that that was not the scene for me, and I really wanted to be studying an animal that allowed me to indulge my well, let's just say that Doug Chadwick got it right when he said that secretly most people who work on wolverines really want to be wolverines. So I started working with the Absaroka Beartooth Wolverine Project, and then it turned out that there was this unstudied population of wolverines in Mongolia, and it also so happens that I am fluent in Mongolian. And I think I'm probably the only person on the face of the planet who has skills in these two unique areas, wolverines and Mongolia. And so the Wolverine research community, many of whom you saw in this film, mentored me through the process of starting this project in Mongolia. And it's been an incredible privilege to work with all of them. But the interesting thing about wolverines in Mongolia is that's the southern extent of their range in the other hemisphere. So here in the Rocky Mountains, you see wolverines reaching the southern extent of their range in the western hemisphere, and they split into this metapopulation where they're existing in population nodes scattered in these mountains where there's enough snow for them to survive. The same thing happens in Mongolia, but the environmental and sort of human circumstances are extremely different there. So part of the point of working in Mongolia is to see, because they are still data deficient, even though we have enough inference now scientifically to say that we're pretty confident that they're at risk due to climate change, we still know so little about this animal, and it is so hard to study. And, I think that part of the point of doing the work in Mongolia is to see what we might be able to learn about what conditions allow wolverines to persist over time, because they were never extirpated there. There's no infrastructure. The human population density is incredibly low. And there are all these sort of interesting dynamics that are going on there that perhaps by doing a little bit of comparative work, we can actually learn something about how we could take particular management actions that might allow them to persist in the face of climate change. And briefly also, I run a Wolverine blog, which I know is sort of more a claim to narcissism in this day and age than a claim to fame, but this blog is about wolverines, it's not really about me. So I'm pretty familiar with all of the literature, and it's a place to sort of check out what's happening in the wolverine conservation world, and some assessment of the scientific literature as well. I do think that wolverines should be listed, perhaps for slightly different reasons than most people. I think that wolverines sort of encapsulate the major challenges that are going to face conservation as it reinvents itself in the face of climate change, particularly wildlife conservation. You know, you're starting to deal with issues of how we cope with extreme uncertainty, how we cope with threats that extend far into the future, how we cope with threats that stem from exploitation of a commons rather than exploitation of private property. And these are all, you know, these are going to be defining issues for conservation in the coming century. So I think that wolverines are sort of a catalyst for exploring some of those major issues. And I would love to see them back in Colorado too. So I'm looking forward. I'm hopeful that the reintroduction will go forward and we'll all get to see that. I'm going to stop there. But thanks all for coming out. It's really exciting to see people developing an interest in this amazing species.
I'll just use this if that works. Can everybody hear me? No? Oh, okay. I'll use this one as well. Is this better? Oh, yes. Excellent. I, too, want to thank all of you for joining us on your Wednesday evening. The wolverine is such an incredible critter, and it's great to get to learn a little bit more about it. My name is Caitlin Balch-Burnett, and I work for Defenders of Wildlife. We are a national nonprofit wildlife-based conservation group. Our headquarters are in Washington, D.C. I'm based here in our Denver office. I'm really excited to be a part of this. My colleague here, Paige Singer with Rocky Mountain Wild, together we're sort of in a tag team, the conservation community's perspective on some of the topics that our other colleagues up here spoke about. Paige will jump in if I miss anything. But speaking from sort of the conservation community's perspective, I think first and foremost we want to see wolverines protected. We would say that this potential listing for wolverines as threatened is definitely a great first step. Backing up a little bit, Defenders was part of the groups that Bridget had referenced in terms of petitioning the Fish and Wildlife Service to list the wolverine. So as an organization, we've been focused on this critter for roughly a couple of decades. Our main wolverine expert is based in our Missoula, Montana office, Kylie Paul up there. And so she's been tracking this critter for us from afar. So we obviously have put a lot of effort into getting protections for this critter, and when that was announced that they would be proposing listing them as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, we were excited about this first step. Additionally, alongside that was the proposal to potentially do a reintroduction into Colorado. I think the conservation community would say that's one of the most important things we could do for the overall wolverine population, is getting them on the ground, certainly knowing that climate change is a real threat for them, and knowing that the potential benefits that Colorado has that we've all heard, so that we're a high elevation. We have over 50 peaks that are over 14,000 feet. I'm sure most of you know that if you are an avid outdoorsman here in Colorado. We also have the snow that lasts into the late summer or late spring that scientists have said is really crucial for the wolverines, for their denning, also for food caching and that sort of thing. So it's unique that we have this opportunity. Certainly, M56 that was mentioned in the film is that lone wolverine who traveled into Colorado in 2009. Correct me if I'm wrong. He amazingly crossed I-80 in Wyoming over Memorial Day weekend. Is that right? To make his way down here. He's a pretty incredible guy. I'm not sure if he is still in Colorado. I think the last time we saw him was in 2012. But certainly this is a great habitat for them. While we did see a male that traveled down to Colorado, folks in the scientific community are less certain that females would make that long distance travel. M56 traveled maybe over 500 miles to get here. So it is possible that there needs to be some human help there in getting these guys back to Colorado. So that's certainly where the conservation community would applaud that. Additionally, from our standpoint, we would like to see some things in the rule a bit stronger. So as Bridget had mentioned, this last year has been a comment period, so for a chance for the public as well as conservation groups like Defenders and Rocky Mountain Wild to really weigh in on these proposals, to be able to share new information or new scientific information. Also a chance to get the public to, weigh in on a potentially really fascinating critter that can be in your backyard. And so in addition to certainly supporting a lot of the things that the Fish and Wildlife Service has put out there, Defenders specifically does have some thoughts about, hopefully improving the rule, making the protections for wolverines a little bit stronger, knowing that they do have threats that are, tough to understand, like climate change. Additionally, we feel like there are some benefits that come from a federal listing. A couple of things, but I think one of the strongest ones is the fact that there can be some more resources provided to learn more about these animals. You can tell that there are some informational gaps in there, just simply because perhaps the funding isn't there for some programs. So that's where the Endangered Species Act can come into place in an important way of providing some additional resources for people who are, still trying to learn more about this critter. I think I wanted to also just touch on the public comment portion of it, and then I'll let Paige weigh in if she has any other things. So it's a really unique opportunity when you have the ability to comment on a proposal like this and speak directly to federal agency decision makers about a critter like the wolverine. Bridget mentioned we're still in a public comment period. This is a great time to put some information out there. I would encourage you all to do that if you haven't done so already. I know for a lot of the conservation community, we focused on the public comment period that happened about this time last year. So you may have weighed in through that process already. But it's such a unique opportunity, and you don't have to feel like, gosh, I'm not a scientist. I don't know anything about these critters. I attended this screening. This is the first I know. It's still an opportunity to weigh in and to talk about why it's important that animals are protected, why this animal specifically is protected, and so that's a great opportunity. I would also encourage you, if you are interested in learning more about wolverines, about the way that you, the general public and interested citizens, have. There is outside of the door over here, there's a clipboard you can sign up to receive information from Defenders and Rocky Mountain Wild. One of my biggest roles with Defenders is to always provide these opportunities for getting people active in wildlife conservation issues. So speaking your mind and weighing in on these important decisions is a big part of what I do. So Defenders is always wanting to send information and let you know about the ways that you can participate in a meaningful way in some of these really important decisions that we have in front of us. So feel free to sign up, or certainly come and contact either Paige or I afterwards. And then finally, and then I'll be quiet, as Bridget mentioned, we are expecting the final decision from the Fish and Wildlife Service in August of this year. I think that's a really important time just to keep your eyes open and your ears open for opportunities to get involved and to maybe weigh in on the decision that the Fish and Wildlife the Service made. Letters to the editor are one of a very crucial tool, especially in advocacy, and we imagine that there will be some articles written about the listing decision, so another really powerful way of weighing in and sharing some of the concerns or applauding the decision, or however it all works out to be. It's another really important way of being involved and having a sort of stake in one of the really amazing animals coming back to Colorado.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? As Caitlin mentioned, my name is Paige Singer. I work for a small regional conservation organization called Rocky Mountain Wild. We focus here in Colorado and then go up a little bit into Wyoming, down into New Mexico, and over a little bit into Utah. The only thing I would add to what Caitlin had to say is that other than being very excited about the potential of getting wolverines back into Colorado, into their native habitat. One of the other reasons that we're able to be supportive of a 10J or an experimental non-essential designation is that, as Bridget said, wolverines aren't management-heavy species, and a lot of their habitat here in Colorado, we feel, is already fairly well protected. They live in the ice and rock, which in Colorado, a lot of it's already wilderness or roadless areas. So it makes us feel more comfortable that they're going to succeed if we bring them down here with fewer protections under experimental non-essential designation than they would have if they were fully protected by the Endangered Species Act.
So do you have anything else to add to that?
I just have one point. Just one thing I wanted to be clear about. We've talked about this with a big if in front of everything, and I don't know that I emphasize that enough. I mean, there have been no decisions made as to whether or not Colorado Parks and Wildlife will go forward with a reintroduction, regardless of the final rule. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that whatever the Fish and Wildlife Service says is going to dictate how we go forward. There's still several approvals that we have to go forward, both internal and external, to have the approvals to even consider going forward. So just wanted to make sure that point was clear.
In what ways would you want the regulations to be strengthened in particular?
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question. So defenders submitted comments, I think roughly 20 pages long, and so if this is something that you really have a lot of interest in, I would be happy to get your contact information and be able to share with you the very detailed specifics. But for the most part, for defenders' point of view, one of the things that we focused on was the idea that it's that human activities in wolverine habitat potentially haven't been very well studied, and it's hard to know their direct impacts at this point. And so there's some thought about providing some language within the rule that would help to clear up that if as we have more studies that come forward, that there's some flexibility if we do learn that some sort of human activity does impact wolverine denning or some aspect of the wolverine's life cycle, that we would be able to still have protections in place to ensure their survival. That's one of the main ones. But again, I would be happy to get you the actual copy of our comment letters, and I'm sure Rocky Mountain Wild would also be happy to share theirs and their specific details. Yes, I'm not sure if that's any better.
This is a question. Eric, I don't know if I'm coming through on this or not. It probably doesn't matter. Can you briefly describe the role of the state in this process? That the Fish and Wildlife Service decision whether to list and may go forward. What role does the state have in the entire process?
Well, a couple of ways to look at it. Until a species is listed, until it has federal protections, it's, regardless of game or non-game, it's a species that the state manages. So even till now, Wolverine is a management authority of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Old Colorado Division of Wildlife. If it becomes a listed species, and we are a stakeholder/partner through this listing process, we've submitted comments, we've been engaged with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We don't have data or science to share with them in making their determination. Much of that science is coming from Montana. Many of the people that you see here, as they're making their listing decision based on the best available science. That we don't necessarily have too much of a role in that aspect of things. If it does become a listed species, it gets into a little bit of a fuzzy area. A reintroduction program, again, if it were to go forward, would be a state-run process, largely because Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't have the resources to do something like that, whereas we do. But it's very much a state-federal partnership throughout that.
Okay, and one final follow-up, if I may. What position has the state taken on the potential for listing?
Frank, we haven't said one way or the other as to whether we think it should be or shouldn't be listed. And in fact, along the same lines, we haven't said if we would or wouldn't do a reintroduction. You know, it's based on addressing those social, political, and economic concerns.
Thank you.
It's my understanding, I could be incorrect with this, but that there's still trapping allowed of wolverines outside of Glacier National Park. I saw you shake your head. Is that not true? I read the book The Wolverine Way, and my understanding in that book was that once the wolverines were out of the park, they were susceptible to trapping. And I was wondering if being put on whatever kind of list it might be put on, will that stop that?
Yeah, the state of Montana is the only state within the Wolverine range that currently does allow trapping. And they did prohibit it. I guess it doesn't work. They prohibited it for a long time. And when the numbers in Montana of Wolverine got large enough that they thought it could sustain some trapping, they reinstituted some trapping regulations. It's fairly heavily regulated. They have really decreased the number of wolverine allowed to be trapped there. I think it's 5 animals per year with a cap on the number of females. So it's a pretty small impact at the moment. If the species is listed, though direct intentional trapping of wolverine would need to stop. That is prohibited by the Act.
There was a lawsuit last year that resulted in a restraining order on the wolverine trapping season in Montana until the listing decision is finalized. So last year and this year there hasn't been a trapping season. So that's why I was shaking my head. I just want to clarify.
I just want to know when the last sighting was in Colorado that is confirmed, and how many are likely to be in our state.
The question was when was the last one cited and how many are likely to be in the state? So it was alluded to in the movie and a little bit on the panel too. M56 is an animal that was collared by Wildlife Conservation Society outside of Jackson in Tuolumne Pass in May of 2009 and was photographed in Rocky Mountain National Park in June of 2009. And he had an implant, an abdominal implant that we used a VHF implant that we would fly for and try to monitor and keep tabs on him. And so we were able to do that, but not on a very regular basis because they can move so far and we don't have the resources to stay on them every single day. So we would lose them for a time, we would get a report, we would follow up and we would find him. The last time that we had a location on him was in October of 2012, and so that could mean anything. It could mean that the transmitter has died, it could mean that he's moved out of the range, it could mean that he's gone under a rock and died, or we just don't know. It's not a very satisfying end to the story, but it still remains an interesting story. Prior to that, the last known animal in Colorado was in 1919, and there have been a few other instances of wolverines in Colorado, and largely those dealt with either escapes from the Shine Mountain Zoo or also some budding wildlife enthusiasts taking it upon themselves to release them in Aspen area. the question is, if we see sightings, or if people hear of sightings or have their own sightings, do we want to hear about that? And yes, we do, especially if they're fresh, and especially, of course, if there's photographs or movie or video or something. And sightings can be an animal or a track or anything like that. There is a pamphlet out there that does have information. That won't get directly to me. The way to get it directly to me is to go to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife website, and there's a Wolverine form on that, an observation form that will generate a report that comes to me. And so I assume that if it went to there, if Caitlin gets a report, she'd pass that on to us as well. So yeah, getting a report, especially something fresh within a day or two, is very important to us.
Well, they're data deficient, so it's hard to say. But somewhere between 10 and 15 years. I think in captivity they've lived up to 15 years. I don't think anybody's ever tracked a wolverine through its entire lifespan in the wild. I mean, it would be an amazing, provided in an imaginary world where there were like infinite resources, it would be really great to collar and track an entire generation of wolverines to figure out more about that. Maybe if the reintroduction does go forward, that would be one of the amazingly relevant pieces of information that would come out of that.
Has there been discussion about where in Colorado we would reintroduce them? I mean, we have those high peaks, but a lot of them are windblown with not enough snow compared to what I saw in the movie.
Yeah, so very general discussions, very general thought. We haven't really had even discussions. Whereas with the Lynx program, all of the lynx were released down in the southwest part of the state and in the San Juans. If we were to do a Wolverine project, it would probably be more widespread throughout the state, partly because their home ranges are so much larger and their ability to move such great distances is so much more pronounced, and also the density of animals is so much lower, the anticipated density of animals. So San Juans provides really good Wolverine habitat. The West Elk area and the Gunnison area is a good area. Rocky Mountain National Park is a good area. Flat top, not the park itself, but that geography. The Flat Tops is another good area. So there is widespread good Wolverine habitat throughout the state, and so probably a more diverse geographic range would be used compared to the Lynx program.
We had a question about reintroduction. Wolverine seems to be a challenging species to reintroduce because of the wide range. Have there been reintroductions before, and what kind of challenges might there be?
Yeah, it's a great question. There have not. Nobody has tried to reintroduce Wolverine into extirpated range anywhere, and so we would be the first to do that. There has been Wolverines moved and managed in Scandinavia, which is a completely different geography, completely different system going on there. So Wolverines are trapped and relocated, but they're not necessarily restored or reestablished into a previously native range. And so there's lots to learn, and we would use a lot of the lessons learned from the Lynx program. We've convened a group with Audrey and Jeff Copeland and many of the other people that you saw in the movie and others to generate some thought onto how do you do this? How physically, how do you trap an animal in the log cabin box trap that you saw, get it down to quarantine and get it across borders, get it to Colorado, get it in good body condition. How do you release these animals? How do you keep them from taking off and moving 100 miles from where you release them, because that's in their nature. So there's lots of things that we don't know quite yet in terms of how it would go, and there's lots of lessons to be learned.
So one of the things I noticed in the film was that the transmitters kept dying. I'm assuming that just happens after a period of time, but I was wondering for maybe Rebecca if there have been advances in tracking technology that make it, one, less expensive, and two, that they could possibly last for longer periods of time, so it would be possible to kind of learn more about wolverines that you're collaring now than the ones that you collared in 2007, for example.
Yes, this is a question that I spend a lot of nights lying awake wondering about. Unfortunately, you know, the way that the industry works for developing those telemetry and radio transmitter collars, it doesn't have a huge profit margin, especially when you're dealing with an animal like Wolverines. Like if you design a transmitter specifically for a Wolverine, you're only going to be able to put that onto so many Wolverines and sell so many of them. So unfortunately, the technology remains very expensive, although it is decreasing in cost. I was talking to a woman who's developing like an ear tag, transmitter tag for bears, polar bears, about whether or not she could scale that down to make an ear tag for Wolverines so that you don't have to put them through this, you know, implant surgery and the stress of collaring. It's just like stick it on their ear and let them go. But for various reasons, it seems like that's not going to work out. So we're trying to have those conversations. I would really like to collar in Mongolia or like put transmitters on those animals in Mongolia, but it's right up against the Russian border. If your animal goes to Russia, what do you do? You know, so, and then there are basic inherent faults with that technology too, like M56, his transmitter could have just suddenly died, you know, and he might still be out there hanging out, waiting for a girlfriend to show up, and we don't know. So yeah, it's a good question. Hopefully the cost will continue to come down, but right now it's still pretty resource intensive.
I had a question for Caitlin. It's sort of political, financial, I guess. It's about the experimental non-essential ruling. I thought some environmental groups originally opposed that for things like wolves and other species, and I think the history of Vail, like the last lynx that was wild in Colorado, was killed near Vail by a car hitting it a long time ago, and Vail, I thought, put money into the Division of Wildlife and contributed a lot of money to political candidates in order to prevent having lynx listed as endangered or threatened where it might interfere with their ski expansion to build more condos. So from that sort of weird perspective, I'm wondering how sensitive wolverines are to human interaction and whether would we be trying to reintroduce them far away from Vail because Vail might have too much financial and political power in the state.
That's a good question. I might let Eric jump in on the end of that in terms of some of those specifics about, you know, if they are to be reintroduced, what that would look like. But, you know, one of the things that you had mentioned, I think I was having a little bit of a hard time understanding is, you know, Defenders does want to, I mean, there is a level of political involvement in this. I don't think we're quite at that level yet, but, you know, in both a federal and a state sense, you know, Defenders is always advocating for people as elected officials to be pro-wildlife, to support pro-wildlife legislation. We've seen with a number of other animals at the federal level with attempts to you know, delist them or prohibit them from being listed in the first place, or prohibit the Fish and Wildlife Service from having the funds to do any sort of listing. So there are attacks that certainly Defenders and other groups are watching. To my knowledge, the wolverine has not come up as an animal that is causing concern. Right now we have some other ones that are on our radar screen, but it is always important. Defenders certainly advocates for making sure that our leaders, our influential leaders, are pro-wildlife and supportive of a lot of the critters and the environmental laws that were designed to protect them.
And relative to the Vail comments, the Vail did contribute quite a bit of money to the lynx reintroduction program, I think prior to and maybe even after the listing took effect. And so we view Vail in that case as having been a very good partner to working towards getting lynx established. And I don't recall the portion of the question relative to Wolverine. Would we, in terms of location, you know, we certainly can't control the way the animals are going to move on the landscape, but releasing them into suitable habitat is definitely the preferred way, the way we would go about it. And that doesn't mean releasing them onto ski areas or into developed kinds of areas. There is good Wolverine habitat in and around the Eagle Valley, the Eagle River Valley, but yeah, so we wouldn't be releasing into or on Vail by any means. Are they sensitive to human activity? It's a good question. again, data deficiency is tough to make any kind of definitive statement on something like that. The presumption is they will choose something other than that. There's been some interesting research going on right now looking at lynx and recreation and how they do or don't interact. And so there may be some, they're very different species, and quite often lynx and wolverine get lumped together in the same discussion. Part of that's our own fault because that's the way we frame the discussion. They are very different, and so I don't want to insinuate that they're the same in that regard. But there is not evidence, because the wolverine home range is so large, the idea of a ski area having a pronounced effect or a pronounced impact on the viability of an individual or of a population is pretty minimal.
Yeah, there's a wolverine that apparently hangs out in a municipal park in Norway and is really fond of waffles, just like hangs out under the bench and waits for people to feed it waffles. So I think, could a wolverine population sustain itself as like a waffle-eating, park-dwelling wolverine population? Probably not. But, there's some evidence that individual wolverines are not that disturbed by encounters with people.
And I just want to add, you are extremely lucky because I went out with that guy that had the wolverines collared and still didn't get to see one. So I'm still hunting for my wolverine in the wild.
Has there been a lot of exchange of information and resources and stuff between like Scandinavia and Siberia and you guys with Mongolia?
So I'm the first person ever to study wolverines in Mongolia, as far as I know. So I am the exchange conduit for that particular branch of information. There is a lot. The global wolverine research community consists of about 12 people, and they all know each other. And they have an organization, or they did, called the Wolverine Foundation, and that was specifically formed as a place for all of these global wolverine researchers to get together and share information. A lot of those guys have sort of taken a step back because they're kind of retiring now and moving on to doing other stuff. But certainly part of my ambition for my project is to create a dialogue in these climate-sensitive ecosystems that have a lot of similarities, very similar species, in some cases identical species, similar ecosystem processes, similar cultures in certain ways, and really start to have long-term monitoring of climate-sensitive wildlife and ecosystems. So yeah, we try. I don't know if you want to, okay.
Okay, well, thank you guys for coming again. We really appreciate your attendance, and also would like to thank our panelists and give them a warm round of applause. Like they said, if you'd like to sign up for more information, outside the table, there's a sign-up sheet and more pamphlets. And also, See You Wild is going to have, I forgot to mention, an Earth Day concert we're planning on Saturday the 26th. It's Saturday in the evening. We'll have a band into it, and it should be pretty fun. And so if you want to sign up for our email list, they're up here. And thank you guys again.